Imagine witnessing a loved one heading into a war zone carrying a toy gun. That would be devastating to witness. Naturally, you would try to show the loved one that the gun is not real. Now imagine that this loved one ignores all evidence proving that the gun is a toy and insists on going into a war zone with it. You would know that his mind is not right, for surely he's going to be slaughtered. It's the same way when witnessing Black people trying to liberate themselves based upon the ideologies of the Bible and the Willie Lynch slave syndrome. When we attempt to liberate ourselves based upon easily proven works of fiction, we are in fact making fools of ourselves. The mentally enslaved are ignorant of their own mental enslavement, and they fight fiercely against those of us who try to free their minds. Our plight has nothing to do with a biblical fairy tale, and our condition has nothing to do with a silly slave syndrome myth. Here is the truth of our plight and condition. Our oppressors writes all of our narratives and controls how we're depicted within the media. They therefore literally owns our image. They've transformed this fact into their greatest weapon used against us. They systematically distort our image to serve their nefarious racist agendas against us. This includes criminalizing and vilifying us to falsely validate their mistreatments of us. They also dehumanize us to make others insensitive to our plight. It's a well-proven propaganda tactic called manufactured consent to mistreat. They also falsely marginalize us to create the perception that they're superior to us. This creates false assumptions within the society that aids them in maintaining their social dominance over us. And they keep us believing the fraudulent worst about ourselves. This demoralizes us, divides us, and shifts our collective aggressions away from the white society and redirects it against ourselves. As long as we're kept within this condition, we can then be ruled over forever. I just laid out in less than 2 minutes the truth of our plight and condition, presenting an explanation grounded in reality using self-evident facts. And it's so obvious to see that it's like taking an open book test that no one should fail. Our people's minds have been conditioned to not see the plain truth and the obvious, and to instead focus on biblical fairy tales and a slave syndrome myth. The reason why so many Black people are now psychologically blinded from seeing the obvious truth of our plight and condition is because most Black people don't know the truth of what was actually done to us in the past. Yes, we know the generalizations. We know that Europeans exploited their weaponry advantage of guns, rifles, and cannons to invade Africa and to colonize and enslave millions of Africans. But there is much more to that history that the white society withholds from us. Because of this fact, Black people are therefore not functioning based upon an accurate interpretation of the current underlying relationship that presently exists between us and the white society. The first step towards the emancipation of our minds begins with learning the complete picture of what was done to us. The psychodynamic factors presently affecting many Black people today have beginnings that are deeply rooted in our hidden history. Dr. John Henry Clark, the renowned African-American historian and author, said that a history to a people is like a relationship between a mother and her child. History tells a people who they are. History is like a clock that tells a people their geographical time of the day. It gives people a basis to make accurate, concrete decisions in regard to current events. I realize that sounds very complicated, so please allow me to explain what it means in a more simpler manner. Imagine that you're driving a pickup truck down a long, winding road, and you hit a huge bump and didn't notice that something valuable fell from your truck. Then after driving an additional 10 miles, you stopped and then noticed the missing object that had fallen from your truck. By remembering when you hit that large bump in the road, that memory provides you with a mental reference point of where to go to recover what fell from your truck. But if you don't have the memory of the large bump in the road, you therefore don't have the mental reference of where to go to recover what fell from your truck. And therefore, you may never find it. This is why knowing true history is important. Likewise, Black people need to learn our true history in order to gain the mental reference points that's necessary in order for developing the proper counter strategies that are required in order to liberate ourselves. We're now lost and confused today because we've never been taught the true history. Therefore, we don't have a mental reference point to start our liberation from. And this is by deliberate design. White historians cannot teach the true great history of Africa to African people, because to do so, they would then have to admit that they interrupted that great history. They also can't teach true history because doing so refutes the myth that whites are racially superior to Blacks, which that myth is necessary in order for the white society to maintain its social dominance over the Black population. They also can't teach true history because it would reveal that Caucasians have been the most brutally immoral enemies of we Africans throughout history. Furthermore, it would reveal the immense debt that the white society truly owes Africans. The most important reason why they can't teach true history to Black people is because that gained knowledge will provide us with a mental reference point of where to start our liberation. The white society doesn't want Black people to ever gain that knowledge because they know that gaining that foundational knowledge will eventually lead to us developing the proper counter strategies required in order to liberate ourselves. This is proven by a speech made in 1832, presented before the U.S. founding fathers, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and Abraham Lincoln, by Henry Berry, a member of the Virginia House of Delegates. Henry Berry said, "We have as far as possible closed every avenue by which the light of truth may enter the minds of the Negro. If we could extinguish their capacity to gain any light of truth, our work will be complete. They would then be on the level of the beasts of the field, and we then should be safe, and we can rule over them forever." That's by Henry Berry. They don't want us to ever gain a true understanding of what they did to us and what they're continually doing to us. Because once we understand it, once we learn that knowledge, we'll then be able to develop the proper counter strategies that are necessary to liberate ourselves. This is also the reason why they fed so much disinformation into our communities regarding our plight and condition. They've literally got the Black community drowning in disinformation regarding our plight and condition. Millions are now ridiculously claiming that we African Americans are the true indigenous Americans, although countless millions of us have taken DNA analysis and confirmed our identity. We have millions are also now ridiculously claiming that we're the true Jews of a fictional Bible written by our most ungodliest enemies. Millions are ridiculously claiming that we're suffering from a silly slave syndrome myth. Millions are claiming that we're our worst enemies in spite of all the proof to the contrary. The ignorant, naive, and gullible are always the easiest victim of the white oppressor's disinformation propaganda campaign. Fortunately, throughout generations, our ancestors have always provided us with those that have given the spiritual insight and an ability to see through the maze of lies and confusion which our enemies have designed for us. Those of us that have been blessed by our ancestors with this gift of spiritual insight must teach the truth to those of us that are mentally enslaved by the white society. Our ancestors demand this of us. Those who know the truth must teach African proverb. The following provides the truth of what was done to us. The truth that is necessary in order for us to develop the proper counter strategies required for liberating ourselves. If a person is born ignorant, to parents that are ignorant, in a society that is ignorant, lives a life of ignorance, then ignorance becomes the norm. Thus, indoctrination can be called education. A false religion can be called the true religion, and all lies can be called truths. Because this person never knew the truth, therefore his mind was never actually his own. Unfortunately, and to our own detriment, this is the case for we Africans throughout the entire diaspora. Those of us that have been scattered across the globe by the African slave trade, as well as those who remain in Africa living under European domination. We've been stripped of knowing our Black mental liberating truths and have instead been indoctrinated with white mental enslaving lies. Unlike at the conclusion of World War II, when the less than 12-year Jewish Holocaust came to an end, when the U.S. government and the United Nations contributed massive financial support to rebuild the lives of those Jews, there was no moral obligation to do the same for we Africans. Although the African Holocaust lasted hundreds of years longer and resulted in millions of more deaths, when it ended, America, Great Britain, and many other white nations that benefited themselves through their brutal exploitation of Africans felt no moral obligation to restore the lives and culture of African people. They instead focused on their own self-interest. To protect the white societies from massive unified Black retribution, especially given the fact that the white society's exploitation of Africans globally and exploitation of Africa's natural resources continues indefinitely, those white nations, they instead socialized Africans. Socialized is when the oppressors exploits their monopoly over the information that are systematically and repetitively fed into the collective minds of the oppressed to manipulate the oppressed to think and behave in ways that are against their own self-interest and instead in ways serving the interests of the oppressors. Those that have been socialized rarely, if ever, learn of this fact, but it's actually a very common nefarious historical practice. Throughout history, those empires that were brutally oppressive, fearing eventual retribution from those that they brutalized, have always socialized their minds, socialized them to think in ways that prevent such acts of massive retribution. This is all possible because regardless of how intelligent people are, if it's possible to control the information that they receive, it's entirely possible to control what they'll believe. The oppressors always exploit their monopoly over the information that are fed into the minds of the oppressed to manipulate the oppressed, socialize the oppressed to think in ways benefiting the oppressors. Therefore, the beliefs and perceptions held by the oppressed are never truly their own. They're always falsehoods that are beneficial to the oppressors that were deliberately, shrewdly indoctrinated into the collective minds of the oppressed by their oppressors without the oppressed even realizing it. This nefarious practice of socializing the oppressed was never abandoned. It's what has been done and is continuously being done to Black people through the white society's monopoly over information that we receive, which accordingly and logically allows them to control what we believe. It's the true reason why millions of us now think in ways that are more beneficial to the white society and in ways that are against our own self-interest. It's why millions of us now perceive ourselves as being our own worst enemies and revere Caucasians in spite of such a brutally horrific history of the contrary. Our mindsets have never been created by slave syndrome, nor is it the Stockholm syndrome. The absolute fact is that black people have been socialized by the white society. It's how the white society protects itself from massive unified black retribution. If you don't believe the fact that many black people now think in ways that are more beneficial to the white society is not by deliberate design, is not a deliberately created outcome, you are extremely naive. It is always by deliberate design whenever the oppressed start thinking exactly as the oppressors want them to. Brothers and sisters, it's time to wake up to the truth. One love and peace.